That soldier inside that hole was alone in the middle of hell. Wounded, with his heart almost too weak to pump fear through the rest of his body, he waited. He knew very well what had brought him there. It was those moments of war when the victory everyone talks about also feels like yours. The soldier knows about death, he knows the terror of war, but nothing prepares him enough to experience the pure horror of the threat of being torn apart by the enemy. On that day, the Russian advanced alongside his comrades, following the orders of someone who wasn't running with them. He moved forward with his boots pounding on the hard ground, observing the landscape taken over by the somber tones of destruction. The drones were a constant threat along the way. They forced the fighter to divert his attention from the trenches that were his target to look up, fearing that a grenade might suddenly fall on his squad. He knew he was being watched. In the brief moments when they were forced to stop and look for cover, someone would see the damned demon flying overhead with the eye of death locked on them. Sadistically, the drone waited with the grenade at the ready, only moving from one point to another, as if mocking the shots fired at it. But the wave couldn't stop. The Russian tide was high. Each soldier moved through the destroyed trees, walking in an apocalyptic scene you only saw in movies. His imagination had toyed with moments like that, thinking of glory. But now fate mocked the soldier in the midst of terror. The sight of the enemy trench was a relief. It seemed they could finally stop being just targets for the artillery, to put their triggers into action. The wave that reached there had lost some of its strength crashing against the sand, but it was still trying hard to drown the Ukrainians. It seemed possible. The Russian gunfire began to foul the air. The tension on the men's faces was slowly replaced by the drive of the new phase of the battle. They knew that other trenches had fallen. The Russian began to smile. But war mocks man's happiness, making him long for glory only to soon be overtaken by shame and fear. Of the men heard us together and instinctively crouched down. The others still had their eyes on the sights, and they only realized it when the air shifted like a convulsion and hit their bodies. The world turned into black smoke, full of shrapnel. The Russian cursed in the middle of the smoke, looking up and knowing that there should also be some of their drones up there, indicating which path the wave should follow to then flood the Ukrainian trenches. This had already worked many times. The soldiers had seen it that day before leaving their defenses when one of theirs launched the little winged demon at them. Too bad no one noticed that the Ukrainians had also summoned the same demon, but in blue and yellow colors. That flew above that operator. And then it saw in those defenses who was piloting the drone. Then the artillery calmly observed. It was guided by the evil gaze of the lenses, and the shots came, filling the Russian position with smoke. And that was the closest point where the wave could retreat if everything went wrong. And there it would resupply and return to the attack. Unfortunately, it was also close enough to the Ukrainians. The same blue and yellow demon flew through the Russian trench looking for new targets. It found the unguarded ammunition there in the middle, like candy offered to a child. A precise artillery shot sent a dark mushroom cloud into the sky. Up ahead, near the Ukrainian trench, the soldier was still stunned by the explosion beside him. Cursing the absence of his drones, cursing the absence of his artillery. He had no idea what was happening behind him. At that moment, he was just grateful to be far enough away not to suffer the consequences of the shockwave from the grenade that had been thrown. Fortunately, he had escaped the first impact, but the Ukrainian artillery kept going. the sky turned into a storm over the sea of Russian troops and bodies began to pile up. Tired, the men realized that the danger now came not only from above or below, but from behind their own lines as they continued to follow those orders. There was no armored support, much less artillery. Where was the artillery in those days, and the tanks that had often successfully helped to storm the Ukrainian trenches? The soldier prayed for Russian bombs falling from the sky, but all he saw up there was the damned propeller of Ukrainian drones. The first one to retreat started the silent call to return to safety. They were exhausted men with death at their heels. Sometimes that was literal. One of the soldiers was walking with his comrades when his foot landed in the wrong place. The mine exploded, tearing a scream of pain from him that made the man in front stop his escape to help Sevilla. The two stared at each other for a second, but their gazes ended with the understanding that one was certain of death and the other would move on, with the possibility of life and the certainty of shame. Fear outweighed the burden of conscience. Amid the explosions, the man kept going, overwhelmed by the despair of abandoning his comrade and aware that stopping meant dying along with him. To his utter helplessness, he saw smoke rising from the positions further back where he had hoped to retreat. 24 survivors of the advance now had to run back in the open field without cover to a new position. The Russian wave was returning to safety. The tide was receding, but crossing no man's land in the open field was a nightmare. The smell of smoke filled their lungs, suffocating the Russians with fear. The horror grew even greater when the United artillery barrage began again. The soldier saw the bomb explode next to him. The shockwave hit him, trembling across his skin. Almost deafened, disoriented, his eyes barely saw the hole in front of him. There he took cover, wounded and frightened. In no man's land, watching his friends disappear behind the trenches, he remained there for 3 days. Horror by day, terror at night. Knowing it was more likely for the Reaper to prey, to rescue his soul, than for his comrades to recover him alive. From above, the Ukrainian drone watched, like an executioner. From behind, the other Russians waited helplessly. He closed his eyes, thinking about the irony that he was fighting alongside thousands for possession of a land whose ownership people could not agree on. But now, he was dying alone in a dugout trench in what everyone agreed to call no man's land.